Hey everybody, it's our first lecture for Core 103. My name's Dr. Devin Griffiths, and this is for our class on Darwin and Darwinism. I'll be doing this a couple times a week on average, just to sort of help provide you some context for our readings and give you a sense of where we're coming from. Why do I think it's important to lecture like this? Well, there's a lot of context, a lot I've learned about particularly historical periods that you need to know, I think, to really understand what we're reading. So I think these lectures are a nice way to dive into it and give you context for our discussions the following day. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got a little PowerPoint I prepared, and away we go. So this week we are talking about natural theology. And our specific readings were from John Milton and William Paley, and I'll also be talking about someone named Charles Bell a little bit later in this lecture. You weren't required to read any of his work. And let's see if we can get this in full screen. Why is that not working? Presentation mode. There you go. All right. So here's the question I want to start with. What do the patterns of nature tell us? How do we make sense of the things we find out there? How do we explain those patterns? This is sort of the core question I want to talk about today. This is Superstition Mountain in Arizona. Now, twice a year, when the sun lines up in the right way, for about a week, this ridge in the Superstition Mountains casts a very peculiar shadow. It looks like there's a giant mountain lion on the side of the mountain and getting ready to pounce on the town below. As a matter of fact, this shadow is why they call it the Superstition Mountains. So when you see something like this, one of the questions you might want to ask is, how did this happen, right? Why does it look this way? And throughout history, humans who've confronted patterns like this in the world are prompted to wonder what made them, what caused them, why they're there. So that's the question we're going to be asking. I want to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about the way that we approach the material in this course. What we're going to be talking about essentially over the course of the semester is the value of what Lorraine Daston, an historian of science, has called historical epistemology. Epistemology, as a word, is a field of philosophy that's the study of how we learn things about the world. How we interpret information about it. But Daston's coinage, historical epistemology, is more precisely the attempt to understand how things are understood at a particular moment in time by a group of people. Quote, as she puts it, the history of the categories that structure our thought, pattern our arguments and proofs, and certify our standards for explanation. That's how she describes what historical epistemology is. So the whole goal of practicing historical epistemology, particularly the relation to the history of science, is to understand not just what people thought at a certain moment in time, but how they thought about things and why they thought about things in that way. And in order to do this well, it's really important to look at primary documents. In other words, original documents as they were printed at the time in the original words that were used to sort of construct a view of the way people thought. So if we learn something about the history of how people thought and why they thought that way, another consequence of that is it gives us insight into how we think today and why we think the way we do. It reminds us that what seems self-evident today was not obvious yesterday. And perhaps even more important, that some of what is obvious today will be clearly wrong to others tomorrow. It helps us to ask, what are we missing now? But how do we do this? The thing I want to do all semester when we look at these primary documents is analyze the language in the original. In other words, we're going to look at the particular way writers express their ideas and use that language to build a picture of their worldview. And above all, we'll apply this to Darwin. But in order to get a picture of Darwin's worldview, it's important to try to understand the world that he came from, sort of where he began in terms of his engagement with the world. And it's hard to read some of this historical stuff. I admit the language can be kind of dense. So I want you to just lean into that complexity. Reread, look up words you don't recognize, Stop yourself when you notice you're beginning to wander a little bit or think you've lost the thread, and then backtrack and pick that thread back up and kind of think your way through as you go. As you're reading, it's also really important to pay attention to distinctions. Paley is ostensibly making the same argument as many other natural theologians. We'll be talking about another one later today. But what we're going to be discussing over the course of the semester is important shifts in how different writers see the same sorts of problems. Important differences that mark a change within just a handful of years sometimes, and how natural philosophers and scientists were coming to see nature. We're going to begin today by talking about natural theology. Natural theology was both a Christian and a scientific philosophy that held that the natural world provides legible evidence, visible evidence of God's design. That the book of nature, in other words, the world we see around us, was written legibly and rationally, that it was a terrestrial, earth-based counterpart to the revealed religion of Christian scripture, the Bible. And it was part of a longer tradition of what's called Christian apologetics. Christian apologetics does not mean apologizing for Christianity. It was rather a theological tradition defending confidence that Christianity's doctrines were true. And among the different ways that you had to defend it was by showing why Christianity might be consonant with, agree with discoveries within the natural sciences. In other words, just because a natural scientific discovery emerges doesn't disprove the existence of God, but rather, in this argument, proves that God exists. Now, remember, in 1809, when Darwin was born, there are essentially no professional scientists. In other words, there were no people who were simply trained and then paid to simply do science, particularly in Britain. Virtually all of the naturalists, the word scientist didn't even exist. They called themselves natural philosophers or naturalists. Virtually all of them were white men of independent means. In other words, had inherited money. And moreover, most of them had attended college at a divinity school, usually Cambridge or Oxford. But we're not starting with 1809. Rather, today I want to start with John Milton and Paradise Lost, which was written some 150 years earlier. And it's important to think about Milton first, I think, in trying to construct the world that Darwin was born into, because Milton had such an important influence on the sort of cosmic philosophy of later generations of British naturalists. Milton was seen as the great poet of nature, the great poet of God's design, and Paradise Lost was seen as teaching really key lessons in how nature fit together. And remember, Darwin, when he was tramping around South America on the voyage of the Beagle, during his Beagle voyages, carried a copy of Milton's Paradise Lost in his back pocket. So he took Milton very, very seriously, as did his contemporaries. Milton, sorry, this is a little out of order, but as we move through the material today and this week, I want you to keep a few questions in mind. First, and especially think about this, I think, when you're watching the Nye and Ham debates over contemporary debates about intelligent design. First, rather than simply paying attention to the details of the argument, what is the shape of the argument that the individual writer or debater is making? What kind of stories are told? What sort of plots are featured? And those plots, what sorts of actors and players feature in those plots? Another key question to bear in mind, how do they talk about time? How long is time? How deep is it? What are the sort of changes that you can imagine in time? What is the sort of reference point for thinking about time on the scale that they suggest? Another important thing to pay attention to, what is the relation between chance and design? How do you make sense of things that do not seem probable? How do you make sense of the relationship between these chancy things and intelligence or pattern? 4, what kind of evidence does the speaker or writer draw on? What sort of sources do they use and consider credible? And finally, what is the role of uncertainty in the argument, the things that the argument cannot account for? And what is that uncertainty supposed to tell us about the way that nature works? Okay, so bear all of these questions in mind. This week, it'll be a good setup, I think, for thinking about Darwin a little later on and what was so innovative about his argument. John Milton. Milton was born in two centuries before Darwin in 1608. So Darwin, 1808, Milton, 1608. Through the middle of Milton's career, he was a brilliant polymath, knew a lot about a bunch of different subjects, and also the foremost poet of Britain in his time. But he was also a radical Republican. And at the time, to be a Republican meant somebody who fought for individual freedoms as over against the monarchy. They believed in setting up a representative government. He believed that over time, Britain would continue to evolve towards a more democratic structure. Now, during the Great English Revolution, the monarch, Charles I, was deposed and executed. This is in Milton's lifetime. And the monarchy for a time was replaced with a democratic commonwealth. Milton served as a member of that new government until it finally collapsed. And during the restoration of Charles II, he was worried he was an enemy of the new monarchy and went into hiding briefly. So Milton started writing his most famous epic poem, Paradise Lost, as the Commonwealth disintegrated and returned to monarchy. And the politics in Paradise Lost, for that reason, are famously complicated. But we're not here to dive into politics per se, so much as the cosmology that Milton presented in his poem. In other words, the way that his poem understands the nature of the universe and the place of the world within it, the sort of metaphysical as well as physical philosophy that it espouses, because this became sort of a model for the world for future generations. So we'll dive in. In book 5 from Paradise Lost, which we didn't read for today, the angel Raphael sits down with Adam and Eve for a nice little lunch in the Garden of Eden. And immediately, Adam is curious about something. How is it that the angel, as a metaphysical being, is sitting here eating the same kind of food that we're eating? And in the Garden of Eden, they were vegetarians. So he's sitting there eating fruits with them and enjoying it, clearly. And Adam's kind of curious how that's possible. How do angels eat, in other words? And this is in book 5, from about lines 404 on. Oh, shoot. So Adam says, hold on a second here. Let me read it out for you. Sorry, this is a little wordy, but it's important to set up the background. Inhabitant with God, Adam asks, now know I well thy favor, in this honor done to man, under whose lowly roof thou hast vouchsafed to enter, and these earthly fruits to taste, food not of angels, yet accepted so, as that more willingly thou couldst not seem at heaven's high feasts to have fed. Yet what compare? In other words, what can you compare this with, and how is it that you can, I'm honored that you're sitting here enjoying this meal, but how is it possible that you may? To which the winged hierarch, the angel, replied, O Adam, one Almighty is, from whom all things proceed and to him return. If not depraved from good, created all to such perfection, one first matter all, endued with various forms, various degrees of substance, and in things that live of life, but more refined, more spirituous and pure, as nearer to him, to God, placed, or nearer tending, each in their several active spheres assigned, till body up to spirit work, in bounds proportioned to each kind. So from the root springs lighter the green stalk, and from thence the leaves more airy. Last, the bright consummate flower, spirit's odorous breathes. Flowers and their fruit, man's nourishment, by gradual scale sublimed. To vital spirits aspire, to animal, to intellectual, to give both life and sense, fantasy and understanding, whence the soul reason receives, and reason is her being, whether discursive or intuitive. Discourse is of test yours, and latter most is ours, differing but in degree, of kind the same. So in other words, what the angel is arguing to Adam is that I can eat this material stuff because all of matter and all of life exists on this continuous spectrum from the material to the spiritual. And as a matter of fact, everything is working its way up along that spectrum, which is why, though I'm above you because I have more spiritual ability, even your own ingestion of plant matter involves a kind of sublimation or transformation of it into something more spiritual, more pure in terms of its ability to fuel your intellectual activities. And he goes on to say, over time, perhaps even humans will continue to become more spiritual and more like the angels. As he puts it, if I continue on here, wonder not then, this is line 491, what God for you saw good, if I refuse not, but convert or metabolize as you to a proper substance, in other words, proper to my form. Time may come when men with angels may participate and find no inconvenient diet nor too light affair. In other words, someday you may be able to eat what I normally eat in heaven as well. And from these corporal nutriments, perhaps your bodies may at last turn all to spirit, improved by tract of time, and winged ascend ethereal as we, or may at choice here or in heavenly paradises dwell. So what Raphael is laying out here for Adam is the doctrine of what is called the scala naturae, the scale of nature. And that's why I've sort of highlighted this passage here. By gradual scale sublimed, in other words, that transformation of material into spiritual essences is modeled by the ranking of all creation in existence, the way in which plants are below animals, animals below humanity, humanity below the angels, and the angels below God. There's a scale of nature. But notice, and I'll tell you more about scale, in Milton's account, it is a transforming scale. People are able to sort of move potentially up that scale, Raphael suggests, although is not certain. Okay, so if you want to understand how a term like this works in one of our readings, one of the best places to turn is the Oxford English Dictionary, otherwise known as the OED. And the reason why the Oxford English Dictionary is so effective is because it doesn't just give you the definition of terms, it shows you the history of how they're used over time. In other words, the way that the ideas that they convey evolve throughout history makes it a really powerful tool for figuring out historical epistemology, for analyzing the language and understanding what they're saying in a moment and why, and what it tells us about how they think. So the word scale, as the definition in the OED explains, is from Italian scala or the Latin scala. And its first definition in English, used in the 1400s, was as a ladder. In other words, a scaling ladder. So it's got this continual sense of a ladder that you can move up or down on. But there are many other definitions that evolved over time. For instance, the second major definition includes music within it. For instance, a defined series of sounds ascended and descended by fixed intervals, or any of the graduated series of sounds in which the octave is divided, the sounds varying according to the system of graduation adopted. Now, Milton was actually a very talented musician, and he writes about music a lot in both Paradise Lost and his other works. So when he thinks about something like the scala naturae, he imagines that the musical scale, the movement sort of up to the higher notes, corresponds to the physical scale of nature that he's talking about. And the ability to move between them is important both to music and his imagination of nature. Finally, it can mean a successive or series of steps or degrees, a graduated series, a succession or a progression, especially a graduated series of beings extending from the lowest forms of existence to the highest. So phrases that would be used in the sense would be scale of being, scale of creatures, scale of existence, the scale of life, or the scale of nature. In Latin, the scala naturae. Now, this is often also referred to as the great chain of being, and various versions of the great chain of being date back for thousands of years. But the important thing to recognize is that in the 17th century, they very much believed that humanity existed within this chain of being, and it was possible for individual humans to possibly move within it, and there was a chance there was a wider evolution within it as well. So the question we should ask first is, where are animals in the scale of nature? And then how does Milton locate Adam and Eve within that scale? Here's where Book 8 comes in, where Adam talks about Eve's creation and pursues these questions with the angel Raphael after Eve has sort of left the dining table and gone off to do some other stuff around the garden. So it's important to note that Eve's creation is narrated twice in Paradise Lost, once by Adam and once by Eve. And there are really important differences in those two accounts, which people pay a lot of attention to and have written quite a bit about. We'll just say that Eve is not quite as enamored of Adam as Adam is of Eve on their first encounter. But she's also left more in the dark. She doesn't have Raphael explaining as much to her, and God never speaks directly to her as well. Rather, she has to learn most of what she does in Paradise Lost by figuring out for herself or asking Adam. So Adam's discussing with, talking about his discussion with God about where he stands in the scale of nature. And he says, for none I know, this is line 406 to 7 in book 8, which you do read. For none I know, second to me, or like, equal, much less. Right? So this is what he's discussing with God, the need for a partner. He wants somebody close to him. He says, there's nothing equal to me, and there's nothing even close to me within the Garden of Eden. It's all animals and plants. And from that conversation, God agrees to create a helpmate for Adam, and in Adam's account, removes one of his ribs and creates Eve. The problem in this account, as Adam struggles with in his ongoing discussion, is how does he make sense of the fact that Eve is supposed to be made of him and made slightly inferior to him in the scale of nature, when he sees Eve, he believes she's at least his equal. He's totally in awe of her. In other words, he can't believe that Eve is inferior to him in the scale of nature. And he begins to ask himself, should I believe what I perceive, or should I believe what I'm told? And his whole debate with Raphael is this difference between what his intuition tells him or what he sees, and the doctrine that Raphael's insisting he should believe as delivered from what he knows of God. So from Milton's point of view, this problem of what do I believe versus what do I perceive is central to the fallen world. And it's shown in the difficulty we find in figuring out how the world works. We're forever haunted by this rift between truth and perception. Put simply, in a fallen world, humans are imperfect. How can we learn to trust our perception of that world then? And under what circumstances should we believe our senses and believe the theories we produce on the basis of evidence that the senses provide? One answer, the one that Raphael gives Adam repeatedly, is that you must put trust in your faith in God. If what you see reinforces the faith, believe it. If what you see does not, disbelieve it. Now, I want to emphasize this is a philosophical problem, a problem of epistemology as much as religion. Milton is saying that the rift between truth and perception emerges after the fall from grace in Eden. But for his contemporaries, it was a basically skeptical philosophical insight. In other words, it was the insight that we must always recognize that what we think we know is based on perceptions, which might be faulty, and that the truth, by contrast, is always out there, but always uncertain. So this is the state of play in the 17th century. And yet a lot of the central tenets of this argument remain very much alive in Darwin's time, particularly the belief that there is an ordered scale of nature, that God designed the cosmos so that everything within it had a specific place, even if that place was not obvious. So we'll see how this is playing out a little at the beginning of the 19th century in Paley's writing. William Paley was born in 1743. He was the son of the headmaster at a preparatory school, and he attended Cambridge. In fact, he never left Cambridge. He ultimately became a professor of moral philosophy and ethics. Now, late in his career, he started working on his own volumes of Christian apologetics, treatises that defended the faith and established arguments for why Christianity made sense. And again, this is the bread and butter of somebody working in a place like Cambridge at the time. And his book, Natural Theology, published in 1802, was the culmination of his career in that work. Okay, so we have simpler printing than some of the other stuff we've read, big letters here. And one of the good points of sort of looking at these documents in the original is you can sort of interpret a little bit, even basic decisions about the way that the page is constructed to understand a little bit about the work. The reason why a book would be printed in big print like this, as opposed to, say, Charles Bell's book, The Hand, which we'll all be talking about a little later, from 30 years later. This difference in printing styles here reflects that Natural Theology was a popular work. It was intended for a really broad audience, especially for people who maybe were less experienced at reading, whereas Bell has a denser type because he's expecting a sort of more advanced reader and sort of more limited readership. Okay. The important point about this, and one we'll come back to a little later in the semester, is that the objects tell stories. And that's the value of looking at these primary materials. In the original, you can work to pull out the details, analyze them to construct the historical epistemology of what this work is doing and why, and how does it understand its audience and its task. So Paley's goal in natural theology is to show that we can look at nature and see the evidence of design everywhere. But his strategy in this work is a little wily. He doesn't start with that argument immediately. Rather, he spends the first 2 chapters arguing about, of all things, clocks. We'll start with the very opening passage. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how that stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I'd been given before, that for anything I know, the watch might have always been there. This is the beginning of his argument. And this is sort of the sequence of the way that it works through. First, he wants to emphasize that the presence of a watch shows purpose, as he puts it on page 2. That the watch, quote, must have had a maker, as he puts it on page 4. But then he runs through a series of possible objections to that claim, that if you find a watch, there must be somebody who made it. And one of the main objections is that the translations from the analogy and various arguments against analogy, for instance, metallic nature, sort of engage this question of like whether or not nature itself could have evolved something as complicated as a watch, whether or not it has sort of like a clockwork mechanism of its own. But the most important thing that shows up in natural theology is the sort of statement that shows up on page 2, which is the articulation of a theory of intelligent design. Quote, there cannot be design without a designer. There cannot be contrivance without a contriver, order without choice, arrangement without anything capable of arranging, subserviency in relation to a purpose without that which could intend a purpose, of a means suitable to an end, and executing their office and accomplishing that end without the end ever having been contemplated or the means accommodated to it. The basic argument of intelligent design is if there is design, there was an intelligence that designed it. If you recognize design, there must be a mind behind it. So what I want you to read here is a kind of catalog, a vocabulary of intelligent design in natural theology. In this little passage, you have the encapsulation of all the words and terms and frameworks for thinking and explaining this kind of problem. Now in chapter 3, Paley shifts the grounds of his argument. Up until that point, he's been comparing life to a watch. But in chapter 3, he launches into a new comparison, imagining automatons, essentially robots. And essentially, he specifically insists that both clocks and other organs are automatons, which basically are sort of perpetuating machines. The question he wants to ask is, could the machine have created itself, or does it require something to have engineered it? So here's the big question if we step back for a second. In thinking about historical epistemology, in this particular case, what is the basic structure, the basic category of thought that Paley is using to work through this problem? What sort of discourse or vocabulary is Paley invoking to re-examine the question of life? And the most important sort of vocabulary he's using here is the relationship between mechanism and organicism. By the 19th century, obviously, mechanical construction, engineering had become quite sophisticated. Everybody's really familiar with complicated mechanisms like clocks or other machines. And so what you can see Paley doing is using that vocabulary to redescribe what we encounter in living organisms in order to make the case that just like complex machines, organisms need a designer that put them together. But then he writes a second question, or maybe a third or fourth question: why is it that we need a contrivance at all, right? As he puts it, why, in other words, is it the case that God sort of works through and designs things and yet removes himself from our presence and relies upon us interpreting these things to infer his existence? As he puts it, it is only by the display of contrivance that the existence, the agency, the wisdom of the deity could be testified to by his rational creatures. This is the scale by which we ascend to all the knowledge of our Creator which we possess, so far as it depends upon the phenomena or the works of nature. In other words, what he's saying is the reason why we see these designs in nature is they are placed there for humans to recognize that God is around, right? He's claiming that just as Milton said that perhaps all beings are able to sort of move up the scale of nature, our sort of mental scale of improvement is organized through our capacity to see these patterns in nature and recognize the necessary implication, according to Paley, that God created these things. In other words, he argues there's a really important function in God not simply instilling in us innately a knowledge of God's existence, but forcing us to work through this process of induction. The last thing I want to put up, sort of point out in Paley, is the way that he deals with chance and the apparent errors of nature. Paley has basically two things to say about the fact that you can see things out there that do not seem particularly well designed or intelligent. On the one hand, what does he say about phenomena that looks unintelligible? For instance, organisms like the spleen or the appendix that we don't seem to really need. As he puts it, irregularities and imperfections that we find in nature are of little or no weight in the consideration when the consideration relates simply to the existence of a creator. But also, he argues, blemishes ought to be referred to some cause, though we be ignorant of it, other than the defect of knowledge or of benevolence in the author. In other words, when we think about the massive evidence, he claims, the majority of evidence points to there being design, and therefore a few things that look like they're not working should not outweigh all the other evidence we see. But at the same time, he says, the reason why a few things look like they're not working is because we simply don't really understand them yet. In other words, we may be ignorant of these things and therefore think they are errors, but we should not believe that that is because of some defect of the knowledge or benevolence in the author. As a matter of fact, those seeming errors may serve some sort of function. So on the one hand, what he's saying is advanced structures cannot come about by chance. Quote, in the human body on page 68, chance, i.e. the operation of causes without design, may produce a wen, a wart, a mole, a pimple, but can never produce an eye. And also, it provides constant evidence of a scale of nature, as he puts it on 71. Those which survive should be cast, as we see that animals are cast, into regular classes, not explained by the argument for chance or the decay of those badly formed, right? So in other words, when we follow these patterns through, we see that everything has its place, that everything is well designed, and errors that we may discover or imperfections within that sort of order of creation should be sort of ignored or recognized as simply our own ignorance. So one key point to take away is the fact that organisms are ranked suggests a wider thought, that there is a conformity or a match between the way nature is organized and the way that we learn about nature. In other words, the nature of nature itself and our epistemological encounter sort of march hand in hand. It has improvement within it, and we have improvement in our understanding. But Paley also emphasizes that you don't need to understand the whole plan or the whole system. As a matter of fact, perhaps you cannot. And so any single example, like an individual organism or organ or organism, should be sufficient truth. One single watch should be able to make the whole case. I want you to hold on to this for later discussions of Darwin, where he has to deal with the relationship between singular examples and sort of wider philosophy. So the last portion of the lecture, I'm going to turn towards the works of Charles Bell, a contemporary of Darwin's, in order to sketch out the complications within the argument for natural theology. and show that even though various writers expounded the same broad arguments for natural theology, they did it in different and evolving ways. And this will help us see how later writers, even when they were on Paley's side, could often acknowledge, point out, and then try to repair holes in Paley's argument. Charles Bell was born in 1774, and he was one of the most important anatomists of his time. He was a doctor who specialized in amputations, but he wasn't very good at that side of his practice. 9 out of 10 of his patients died. Remember that this was before we had sterilization or antiseptics. And so the real thing that discriminated being a good amputator from a bad amputator was how fast you could cut. And unfortunately, Bell apparently was kind of slow at cutting. You can compare this to Robert Liston, a Civil War surgeon, who Listerine is named after. He was known as the fastest knife in the West because he could cut a leg off in 2.5 minutes. You'll do it really quickly, would save a lot of lives. So Bell, by contrast, was a better scientist than a doctor. And he discovered that there were different kinds of nerves in the body. He recognized that some nerves were sensory nerves that communicated information to the mind, and others were motor nerves that were used by the brain to control the body. In other words, that there were different lanes within the nervous system. This is a major, major insight. And he also became the first to give a careful account of what is now known as Bell's palsy, which remains an important diagnostic pathology today. And it's an often temporary phenomenon whereby the muscles on one side of the face relax and can't sort of express themselves and show emotions. And there are lots of different sort of causes of Bell's palsy that are recognized. But the reason we're studying him today is because in the 1830s, Bell was asked to write a Bridgewater treatise. So the Bridgewater treatises were a series of tracts, really small books, written by experts in their field who were committed to the belief in the design of nature to sort of advance the cause of Christian apologetics from their particular disciplines, whether it be astronomy or geology, or in Bell's case, anatomy. And his task to write was to write on sort of anatomy in general. But as he explains at the beginning of his treatise, he thought to talk about various organs, right? Talk about all of them, but instead decided to talk about singularly the hand, as he puts it, its mechanisms and its endowments. And he says this one example can sort of make the wider case for how anatomy testifies to God in general. But I want to pay attention to the way that Bell enters into his argument on page 15. Here's how he puts it. If we contemplate any natural object, especially any part of animated nature, fully and in all its bearings, we can arrive only at this conclusion, that there is design in the mechanical construction, benevolence shown in the living properties, and that the good predominates. We shall perceive that the sensibilities of the body have a relation to the qualities of things external, and that delicacy of texture is a necessary consequence of this relation. Already here, you see a slight shift in the way that he talks about how you're supposed to read the individual organ or object. His argument is not simply that the design of the organ or organism shows the intelligence of a designer, but more importantly, that it shows the interaction between that organism, the way in which the design of the organism is designed to interact with its environment, and the nature of the environment itself. In other words, it's placing that thing within a wider world and showing the interrelationship between the two. As he puts it, wonderful and exquisitely constructed as the mechanical appliances are for the protection of this delicate structure, they are altogether insufficient. And a protection of a very different kind, which shall animate the body to the utmost exertion, is requisite for safety. Pain, whilst it is a necessary contrast to its opposite pleasure, is the great safeguard of the frame. Finally, as to man, we should be led to infer that the pains and pleasures of the mere bodily sense, with yet more benevolent intention, carry us onward through the development and improvement of the mind itself into higher aspirations. In other words, when you pay attention to the way something like the hand works, it is not simply, you cannot make sense of it by simply looking at how it works by itself. Hold on 1 second. All right, after a brief little interlude, talk with a student, I'm back. This is my dog, Buff. She's wants me to take her out, so I'm going to wrap this up quickly and we'll move on. Right, Buff? Right? Sorry, Kipo, our other dog. His name's Buffy. Okay, so where are we? Page. So I want to emphasize again the way in which Bell marks a kind of turn. If Paley is arguing that the individual example by itself, the watch off on its own, itself in terms of its internal mechanism, shows intelligent design, Bell is arguing you can't make sense of that individual object without relating it to its environment, right? The hand is designed for sensing the world, for perceiving pain and pleasure, not simply for picking things up. So to sort of get a little more background here, one of the things that he is responding to is the work of other physiologists who are emphasizing that what you find in animals in particular is that all of the bodily frame is, among other things, organized in relation to sensation and interaction with the world. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is very famous as the sort of father of Lamarckian evolution, but he was also responding at the beginning of his theories of evolution, as we'll see later, to the work of Pierre-Jean-Georges Cabanis, who was another physiologist who emphasized the way in which the problem of the relation between the mind and the brain is fundamental to the way they interpret all of animal life. In other words, the relationship between mental capacity on the one hand and the physiology of nerves and brain matter and the interaction. In other words, the interaction between matter and spirit, right? So carrying forward something we saw in Milton, but giving a much more precise a location within the body in the way the body is wired together. So in Bell, we get a passage like this on page 17-8 in the hand. There is no doubt the animal frame is formed with a due relation to the earth we inhabit, and that the parts of the animal body, and we may say the strength of the materials, have certainly a correspondence with the weight as the wheels and levers of a machine, or the scaffolding which sustains them have relation to the force and velocity of the machinery, or the load that they're employed to raise. In other words, a bigger creature needs a stronger frame to support the weight, but also, if we look at something like the hand, if the hand was so tough that the skin was like stone, we would not be able to sense anything about the world around us. In other words, everything about our physiology is carefully calibrated to our environment, both to support our structure and our interaction with it, but also to support our ability to sensitively engage with that environment. So what I'm arguing is this essentially rejects one of Paley's key arguments. For Bell, the single example is not sufficient. You have to take a wider view that sees how nature itself fits together, how the wider environment shapes and is coordinated in individual organs like the hand. And he's responding to other writers who are not so committed to the argument for natural design, who are saying that you cannot explain the individual organ or organism simply by reference to its internal mechanism, that it clearly shows that it's sort of integrated with the world in fundamental ways. This is a shift towards a more cosmological or environmental account that is then mapped into the body. In other words, that what we find in the body connects to what's outside the body, that the microcosm is kind of wired to the macrocosm. There's a big shift in emphasis here. Bell is essentially rejecting Paley's emphasis on the singular and doubling down on the total design of the environment as a system and the concordance of the physical plan and our mental and sensitive endowment. Okay. So I'm going to skip forward to the end and simply say this. He is responding to kind of the beauty of the physical hand, right? The beauty of the organism, right? But also saying that what's so beautiful about it is its capacity also to respond to the world around it, its ability to recognize beauty. As he emphasizes, we must hold on to the wonder. We must recognize that the hand is beautifully formed, has such a fine sensibility that governs its motions so correctly that we should be in awe of what we recognize about the way that it works. I want you to hold on to that sense of wonder or awe that you find to some degree in Paley, but much more strongly in a figure like Bell, because that sense of rapture and what we encounter in the world is a very important component of the argument for intelligent design as it existed at the time. And the problem that we'll see that Darwin encounters is when we strip the world of the belief that it is designed, what do we make sense? How do we make sense of that experience of wonder and awe? Why is it that we can appreciate the majesty of nature if at the same time we might want to reject and see good reasons for rejecting the claim that it's because God put all of that there. All right, so think about all this. And if you want to sort of look at other examples of this kind of emotional reaction, you can look no further than, for instance, Sir David Attenborough, who's always narrating these sort of documentaries about nature from the perspective of how amazing and wonderful and beautiful it is. But more importantly, I want you to spend some time with the Nye and Ham debate and look for all of these elements. Where does design and chance play a role? How does time operate? What is the scale of nature? How does the individual connect to the wider world? Is one example sufficient, or do you need many? What sort of evidence is required? And what is the proper emotional response that we should show to nature? And what does that emotional response tell us about the nature of the way the world works? All right, we'll have time to dive into all of this. Take your time with readings and with reviewing the video I shared, and just bring questions on Thursday. I'll be happy to talk through all of them with you when we get back together. All right, take care, and I'll see you soon.